Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I thought that I would read the first 3 chapters of my children's book to you. Back in 2012, I went into Waterstones in search of middle grade fiction that would leave me feeling absolutely discombobulated. I didn't really know what that meant, but it was this sensation that I used to get when watching magical adventure stories as a child, or reading them even. And I found that there was a lot of adult fiction, or the fiction that I was reading for university, that wasn't really leaving me feeling like that. I was looking at all these books on the shelves, not finding the story that I wanted. And so I walked out of the shop and said to my mother, I guess I'll just have to write it myself. That was 9 years ago. In 2013, I submitted the first 3 chapters for my final project at uni, and then I finished writing the book in 2014. I never submitted that first draft anywhere, and I went on to write Our Doris. But the children's book has always been at the back of my mind. In 2017, I decided to start rewriting it and have been rewriting this tale as a side project for a while now. It's a novel that, when I eventually feel that it's up to par, I would like to start submitting to literary agents because it's a tale that I'm rather proud of. And I think that it deserves more. Also, I thought it'd be good to release this video today in celebration of World Book Day. World Book Day is one of those times that I really looked forward to as a child because I was one of those children who rather likes books. And also, we got a voucher, which meant that I could get a book, which, you know, didn't happen often because, as I've always said, my family is and always has been reliably poor. I submitted this book to a competition a few years ago and I was going to read the introduction that I included in a letter about this novel, but I don't think it does the book justice. So I'll read what I put and then I might give a tiny bit more information than I included here. The Book of Heroes follows the 10-year-old protagonist, George Peregrine, a boy raised in a magical library where rogue fictional characters escape their bindings, houses have legs and wander about, and various editions of Peter Pan have gone to war with each other. His guardians are the ugly stepsisters, and his best friend is Mowgli. He longs for nothing more than to go outside to find his parents. In his efforts to leave, he discovers a plot by the nefarious curator, Reuben Sprite, to create an army of fiction's most vicious villains. George is joined by the Uglies and a variety of peculiar friends in his quest to thwart Sprite's plans. Now, to me, that doesn't really say much about the book. George Peregrine was left at the library under the guardianship of the ugly stepsisters from Cinderella. The library is filled with fictional characters come to life and indeed isn't a normal library in any sense of the word. There are actual forests and mountains in here and the enchanted forest. And in this tale, George's best friend Mowgli happens to have his essence drained by an ink monster and is left as little more than a ghost. George discovers that if he travels to the enchanted forest, he might be able to get Mowgli a real body back, and thus sets out on a quest to do so. On the way, he uncovers a plot by the curator of the library, Reuben Sprite, who wishes to create this army of fictional villains for his own means. George also happens to discover more about the secrets of the library and just what saw his parents disappear 10 years prior to the events of the novel. I'm hoping what I just said there actually gives more of a sense as to what this book is about. I've technically been working on it for nearly 10 years now, although I have only been working on the rewrite since 2017 as a side project because I find it quite fun. Middle grade fiction is some of my favourite to read because I feel like you're able to experiment more there, and you can actually include some fun words and just enjoy yourself. And I've rather enjoyed working on this book. I guess now is a better time than any to share the first 3 chapters of the Book of Heroes. Chapter 1. Ghosts and Monkey Chains. At 9 o'clock sharp, a ghost knocked on the front door of the library. George hid 20 feet above on top of the bookshelves. He was a boy amongst apes. They laughed, hands on their stomachs, mouths flung wide. For as long as they could remember, the ghost came each morning and knocked to no avail. Once in a while she called out, but no one let her in. It wasn't that the library didn't like ghosts, it was because no one knew her. George met the closest monkey's gaze and said, "You'd think she'd have learnt by now, but no, every day she comes back." The monkey flung back its head. Spit hung like strands of toffee from its teeth. As only a monkey can, he signed to George in ape before clapping his hands and feet on the old oak bookshelf. The ghost had become something of a library alarm clock. George would walk to his classes each morning and the ghost would knock. Baloo would arrive, unlock the door and make her leave. And over the last few months of walking to his classes, since his last attempt to escape failed, George had concocted a plan. One of the older apes tapped George on the shoulder and held a finger to his lips. George shut up. No one spoke. They crept towards the edge of the shelf and stared at the front door. No footmarks smudged the pine floorboards. The magnificent foyer was empty. George and the apes could see a blurred reflection of the shelves. This wasn't what worried George. What worried George was the fact the ghost had stopped knocking. Why has she stopped? George's eyes were wide as he faced the older ape. We need the ghost to get the front door open. The older ape pointed to the right, and George spun around to see his friend Mowgli swinging from vines above the shelves until he reached them. He landed beside George, staring at the front door as well. She's stopped knocking. You're wearing a dress? George gawped to his friend's attire. When Mowgli first left his bindings, he had been naked. Since his arrival in the library, he had started wearing all sorts of garments, from royal blue knickerbockers to today's outfit, a daffodil dress with flowers sewn into the hem. He swished his dress in George's direction. It makes it easier for swinging from vines. It's a dress, Mo. Boys don't wear dresses. I was raised by wolves. I can wear a dress if I want to. And he swished his dress again to emphasise the point. George rolled his eyes and looked back at the front door. Have you got any ideas? I should have brought you a dress. Easier to swing in than jeans. Then we'd just swing you through the doors. Boys don't wear dresses outside. George slumped down, his legs dangling over the edge of the shelf. They mustn't climb a lot of trees then. Mowgli sat down beside George. I won't bother going outside if I can't wear a dress. George shook his head, his dark brown fringe falling over his eyes. This isn't about boys wearing dresses. I'm 10 years old and I've never left this library in my life. And you're sure the Uglies aren't keeping you here for a reason? Mowgli asked, sitting beside him. Why would they? The curator employs them. It's their job. George took a paper bag out of his jeans pocket and removed a chocolate mouse. Want one? They bring you sweets. It can't be just a job. Mowgli took a mouse and they sat in silence. The apes sat behind them waiting. George chewed slowly. Chocolate mice tasted different to other chocolate. The Uglies joked that they were the chocolate-coated remains of mice who helped Cinderella ruin their lives. George knew it was a lie because they brought him mice every Friday after his classes. George inhaled the sweet, sugary, almost musky scent and smiled as thoughts sprung into his mind. We need to knock on the door ourselves. Mowgli jumped to his feet. Yes, if we get the apes to trapeze and knock enough, Baloo will come to see what's going on, and we can swing me out. George finished Mowgli's sentence and jumped up at this as well. They faced the apes, sat behind them, stoic, their hands on their stomachs, the monkeys fidgeting, eager to cause mischief. Mowgli signed the plan in ape before looking to the oldest ape, a gorilla with streaks of silver through his fur. He smiled, surveyed the youngsters, and grunted. "What's he say?" George asked. Mowgli's eyes brightened. "It's a yes, we can swing." The monkeys cheered and the older apes nodded. George puffed out his chest and closed his eyes. He was finally going to leave the library. He would get to feel the sun on his face, smell more than must and paper, and hear more than rustling pages. Opening his eyes, he stepped back to watch the apes at work. Chimpanzees made a chain of linked tails and held hands, anchored by the 4 gorillas who sat in a semicircle behind them. Once the chain was complete, the gorillas let the chimpanzees fall over the edge of the shelf. They dropped like a bungee cord, fur flung back and eyes wide as they tumbled and twirled towards the floor, and stopped. George grew aware of the length of the chain. The chimpanzee at the base hung with his nose barely an inch from the floor. "I bet he can taste the varnish," George said. "I can smell it from here. You know how Gloria feels about that floor." George nodded, eyes fixed on the scene before him. The chain swung back and forth, picking up speed with each swing, forcing them further forward. The chimpanzee at the base reached out across the foyer, his fist stretched towards the large black door. He missed. The chain snapped back and the chimps flung themselves forward again. At the base, the chimp reached out. He gritted his teeth. George clenched his fists as the monkeys reached for the door and missed. "Mowgli, get the chimps to come back up." George pulled on his friend's sleeve. "I've had an idea." "I thought this was the idea," Mowgli said as he signed to the gorillas. "The chimpanzees are drawing too much attention to themselves. I'll go at the end of the chain, and when the doors open, they can throw me out." When the chimpanzees crested the bookshelf, they glared at George, arms folded. Some of the younger monkeys moaned and groaned and contorted their bodies into rude gestures and swore as only apes can swear. "Calm down." Mowgli pushed at a chimp who kept pulling his hair. He signed for the monkeys to be quiet. They refused, took one look at the humans and showed their bottoms. Mowgli faced the gorillas and signed his apologies and the new plan. "If they don't hurry, everything will go wrong." "I'm trying. You upset the chimps. It'll be difficult to get them to do anything." The eldest gorilla sucked his teeth. He looked from George to Mowgli and back again. George looked at his shoes. His shoulders slumped. He listened as the chimpanzees returned to their vines and swung back towards the jungle. Tears pricked at George's eyes. His face felt hot and flushed red. He'd only wanted to go outside. He hadn't meant to upset anyone. There was a creak as the gorillas shifted. They flung themselves after the chimpanzees, heading home as well. "Stop that! No! Put me down!" George looked up in time to see Mowgli slung over a gorilla's shoulder and carried away. "No! I want to stay here with George!" Mowgli exclaimed. A gorilla grunted in reply. George sniffed and wiped his eyes on his sleeve. A shadow towered over him. He spun around to see the eldest gorilla stood there. "I'm sorry if I upset your family." The eldest gorilla grunted and reached out to George. "What are you doing?" George lurched upwards, dropped over the eldest gorilla's shoulder like a knapsack. He smelled sweat, damp fur, and the unmistakable scent of old cheese. The gorilla turned around, leaned over the edge of the shelf and jumped. George kept quiet. As they landed above the door, the gorilla holding onto the door jamb by his fingertips. He kicked the door 3 times and vaulted back towards the bookcase. As they ascended, Baloo came running. Baloo was the library's security guard. He also happened to be a bear. He wore a belt around his middle. Attached to the belt was a baton, a notepad, a pencil and a torch. He had a bright yellow sash with the word security emblazoned on it in silver letters. As he walked, the bear turned his head this way and that, his beady black eyes shining. He sniffed the air around him. He sniffed the tiles, the walls, and beneath the door. At the door, he breathed in more of the scent he'd found. His snout seemed to travel on its own as the bear followed the smell. "Gorilla. Definitely gorilla," he murmured. "And something else. Now, what is that?" The bear stood on his hind legs and placed a claw to his lips. "Oh, we know what that smell is, don't we? George, get yourself down here." George edged forward and met the bear's gaze. "I'm allowed in the foyer, Baloo. I smell gorilla. He's up here with me." At this, the eldest gorilla leant forward and waved, a grin plastered on his face. "Someone was knocking on the door." "It was the ghost," George shrugged. "I can smell your scent. We were playing. Come down, George, or do I need to call the uglies?" Baloo had him there. If the uglies came, they'd give him the speech, about how they'd raised him, how they'd given up their search for Prince Charming as a personal favour to the curator, and George tried to thank them by running away. George met the eldest gorilla's gaze. "Could you carry me down, please?" The eldest gorilla picked up George, shaking his head. He dropped off the shelf. Books and shelves blurred as he sped towards the tiles. The eldest gorilla grabbed hold of a shelf and they swung in midair inches from the floor. They hopped to the ground, the pads of the gorilla's feet slapping against the tiles. Baloo smirked and settled onto all four paws. "Smart decision, boy. Now, let's get you home." The eldest gorilla grunted and held George tighter. George placed his hand on the gorilla's arm. "It's all right. You can put me down." He put George down, snarled at Baloo, and returned to the shelf. "I'll have to tell the uglies, you know, and this will be recorded on your library card." George felt as though his stomach had been vacuumed out. "I only wanted to go outside." Baloo nudged George forward. "And what would you do outside?" "I want to try lemonade and find out where chocolate mice come from." "Chocolate mice?" George took the paper bag from his pocket and showed Baloo a pink chocolate mouse. "This is a chocolate mouse." Baloo cocked his head to the side. "What do you do with it?" "You eat them." George dropped the mouse into his mouth and chewed. "Want one?" Baloo sniffed the bag wary. "I know your game, boy. Feed me funny food and have me incapacitated. I dare say you'd enjoy that." George put the bag away. "I was only asking." "Well, you can give up squawking and start walking." Baloo sniggered and led the way. George wandered along behind Baloo, scraping the toes of his shoes across the linoleum, the soles squeaking and squelching on the varnish. They loped past aisles stuffed to the brim with books. Books who whispered and groaned and squeezed against one another until the shelves trembled and creaked under the strain. Librarians lingered in the aisles capturing figments, bluish smoke in tall glass bottles with cork stoppers. They placed the full bottles on their carts and, once the carts were stocked, wheeled the figments to the wall hatches at the ends of the aisles. Baloo led George past the 29 aisles to the end of the row. As they walked, it grew dark. More vines trailed down from the jungles and rainforests hundreds of feet above. The air filled with the stinging scent of eucalyptus. George listened to the squawking toucans and the rustling of the creepy crawlies hidden in the undergrowth. "Get in the lift, George," Baloo said. The lift he referred to was a polished steel birdcage set into the hollow of a beanstalk. It was round and towered above George and Baloo. On a swing in the middle of the cage sat another figment, a mere wisp of a girl, coloured a drab grey. She cocked her head to the side and gazed at George through the bars. "Have you ever thought about just opening the door?" she asked. But George didn't hear her. Gnats nibbled at his cheeks as he stared at the beanstalk in front of him. It rose from the tiles, searching for a sun it would never find. George craned his neck as far back as he could, and still couldn't see the ceiling. Branches and leaves large enough to blanket an elephant spread from the stalk, their paths leading to the upper floors of the library. George's eyes trailed down the beanstalk. Thick masses of roots sprawled across the floor, their tendrils rising over bookshelves. Daisies and purple wildflowers strolled from the furry moss. Baloo faced George. "What floor?" George shrugged. "When I woke up, we were on floor 47. "What do you mean, when you woke up?" "Well, the house likes to move a lot. A few months back we lived in a swamp. He's not decided where he likes best yet." "Who?" "The house. Who else? He enjoyed being a boat until the rats came aboard." "Rats?" Baloo asked, his eyes wide. "They nibbled at the sideboard. He wasn't happy. The uglies had to go to Geppetto." "Your house shouldn't be able to move, you know." "Why not? He has to live there as much as anybody else." Baloo slumped, rubbed his snout with his paws. "So, the 47th floor?" George smiled. "That's right." Baloo approached the cage. "The 47th floor, please." The figment zipped from the perch and through the bars. She circled the cage, her arms spread wide as she flew towards the top of the beanstalk, all the while exclaiming, "Floor 47! Floor 47! Floor 47! She disappeared behind leaves, her voice echoing throughout the library. Soon they could hear her no more. "How high does she have to go?" Baloo asked, his eyes peeled. "The 47th floor is above the Peter Pan War and the jungle. Mowgli can only find his way home because he can climb." "That could take hours." "She's a figment, Baloo. It won't take long at all." "How would you know? You're just a boy," Baloo sniggered. A boy who has lived in this library his whole life. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The 47th Floor. The 47th floor hid between the roof of a haberdashery and the burrows of a jungle. House stowed there the previous night, hidden beneath a dusty stone canopy with a floor of cerulean velvet curtains. George led Baloo to a flight of cobbled stairs, the walls white and flaking paint. He pulled himself forwards with the vines hung through the ceiling. "This isn't right," Baloo complained, "and it smells green." "Green?" George stopped and faced the bear. Baloo nodded. "Green, fresh air and must and leaves." "The uglies won't like that. Not at all." George shook his head and kept ascending the stairs. House was lit by melting candles in pools in dishes along the skirting of the room. They towered in tall black candelabras, clicking their golden tongues in a song of sizzles and crackles. A squat china teapot stood on a Gothic mantelpiece, a large yellow candle glaring from its centre. Stone cherubs hung onto the walls with candles in their hands, the flames reflected in their opal eyes. Baloo moaned as he reached the top of the stairs. "All the infractions! Fire in the library! I'll have to report this to the curator." On a long rectangular table sat a cracked glass chandelier, alongside rusty doorknobs, brass carriage clocks, wooden swords, and 2 silver Venetian masks. The masks smoked and trembled, their ruby eyes bright with colour. Light streamed from the gems as the masks rose in the air. Smoke gained substance, and the 2 masks grew heads and bodies. Victorian dresses bloomed like tulips, all ruffles and pleats, one light blue, the other pink, as the uglies awoke. "Reuben knows about the candles, Baloo," said the sister in the blue dress. "You should know your old charge broke the chandelier." "Mowgli has naught to do with me, Euphemia." She shook her head. "No, that's Euphemia with the snout. I am Sempronia." Euphemia struck her sister with her mask. "My beauty is in my eyes. They shine like constellations." "Like cataracts. You're as blind as a bat on a good day." "Tell her, George, she is cruel to me." Baloo coughed. "Ladies, if you please, there is a reason I've returned George to you." "Of course there is, Baloo," Sempronia said. "You certainly weren't invited." The uglies chuckled, flashing the dragon faces beneath their human ones. Yes, well, George employed the apes in another of his schemes. I'd not mind if he took the welfare of said apes into consideration. Sempronia folded her arms, her beady eyes flashed pure black. And what, may I ask, was his scheme? Baloo smirked. He was trying to open the front door. It is my belief he wished to escape. Euphemia gasped, throwing a hand over her mouth. Oh, George, how could you? Sempronia didn't falter. He is not a prisoner, Baloo. He has been placed under our care. But the door! Her eyes flared slightly. Please do refrain from making presumptions about my charge. Perhaps he wished to open the door to let some air in. It can become awfully stuffy in the library at times. Euphemia nodded towards Baloo. It's all the hot air. Baloo stammered. I don't think you're taking this matter seriously. Was the door opened? It's not as though George has let Juno escape, is it? Now kindly leave my home. I'll report this to the curator. Do. I will telephone and let him know you're on the way. Baloo turned on his heel and descended the stairs. George looked up at Sempronia, his fringe over his eyes. I only wanted to go outside. She tapped her fingernails along her sleeves like spiders' legs. I'm a real boy. I should be allowed outside. But George, it's so dangerous outside. You could get yourself hurt, Euphemia said, tears in her eyes. Sempronia glared at her sister. Shape yourself, Euphemia. George does not deserve your mollycoddling. She picked up a piece of paper and handed it to George. You will finish your chores. Once these have been accomplished, you will return here, where you will spend the afternoon under the watchful eye of House. George looked at the floor, scuffing his shoes on the carpet. Why are you punishing me for wanting to go outside? It's not a punishment, George. It is your duty. Sempronia covered her face with her mask. We have a meeting with Reuben. Do not leave the 47th floor. With their faces covered, the uglies evaporated, leaving nothing more than their masks to fly down the stairs. George stood there. He heard clattering in the kitchen and walked over to find cocoa bubbling on the stove. The pan rose into the air and poured its contents into a mug. A cupboard door opened and marshmallows fell from their bag on top of the cocoa. Whipped cream flew from the fridge and dolloped into the drink, before the mug hovered over to George and sat on the table in front of him. Thank you, George said to the house. A tartan blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and he inhaled the scent of cocoa powder, cinnamon, and the sugary marshmallows. George left house with a rucksack on his shoulders. A feather duster poked its tail out of the top, held between two zippers. He scuffed and huffed his way down the stairs, scraping dust clouds beneath the soles of his trainers. He loitered in the corridor, pressed books back into their cases and shuffled the dress patterns in their wall niches. Spiders scuttled overhead and spilled more dust on his shoulders. He hated cleaning. Cobwebs grew thicker in the mausoleum. The spiders made a ton of silk to cover the demand of the haberdashery. They once made an entire nest of cobwebs in his bathtub when they had to make a wedding dress. The corridor opened out onto a circular landing, the floor no longer carpeted with curtains. Red oak banisters surrounded George. He winced as the scent of varnish stung his nostrils. He lingered at the white picket fence, checking the gate's grain against his thumb for splinters. After a few minutes of dawdling, checking his pockets and laces and wiping the dust from his clothes, he unlatched the gate. Down 3 deep stone steps, George reached a rope bridge. He crossed it towards a hexagonal mausoleum floating in mid-air. Grey pillars held the sloped roof up. Stone lions sat on platforms either side of the front steps guarding the entrance. George climbed the steps, focused on the clap of his feet against stone. He creaked open the door with the lion head doorknob and entered. A chandelier flickered to life. George spared a glance at the fairies flinging themselves against the glass droplets trying to escape. He remembered being a toddler and wanting to release them. How he'd begged and pleaded with Sempronia, but she told him that that was the way of things. Now the fairies were nothing more than furniture. Bookcases lined the walls, packed with heavy tomes. Brown leather-bound books filled a table in the centre of the room. Swirls of gold lined the covers alongside mystic symbols. George made his way towards the far side of the mausoleum. He looked from the raggedy piece of paper in his right hand to the thin metal ladder stood in front of a bookcase. It led up, through the roof, up a tree, through the ceiling of the jungle into an area George couldn't see. He pocketed his piece of paper and grasped a rung, pulling himself up. Once he was secure, he started to climb, scanning the shelves in search of cobwebs. As he neared the mausoleum ceiling, he saw the grey gauze of a cobweb. It stretched from the far corner of the bookcase, tiptoed across the tops of books before settling on a copy of the Book of Heroes, a book with a belt tight around its middle. George sighed, reached behind him and took the feather duster from his bag. He pressed the duster into the middle of the cobweb. It latched on and he turned it, winding the cobweb through the feathers. George peered onto the shelf to make sure the cobweb was caught. Satisfied, he dropped the duster back into his rucksack. He edged further up the ladder until he saw the top of the bookcase. It was riddled with cobwebs and dust bunnies and dead flies. George shook his head and retrieved the duster again. He wound the cobwebs, hopped on the dust bunnies and swept up the flies. He grimaced as he returned the duster to his rucksack. The 4th edition has stepped up its campaign. He struggled to hear Sempronia's voice, but hear her he did. Do you believe they had anything to do with the disturbance in Neverland? No, I believe that Crane may have... George didn't hear the rest of her sentence. A snake coiled from the jungle above and hissed against his right hand. He jumped back, forgetting the ladder. As he plummeted towards the floor, he screamed. Only George didn't hit the floor. He didn't have time to scream. His heart flew into his throat as the mausoleum disappeared. He kept falling. Vines and bookshelves and lights streamed past. The library blurred. Air fled his lungs. His arms scrabbled to catch something, but he fell too fast. Something slammed around George's chest. He swung through the air, barely making out the library below. He froze. A hand turned his head and he found himself facing the eldest gorilla. George heard him grunt as everything went black. George smelt disinfectant and the unmistakable citrusy perfume of Euphemia. He must be in the medical bay. Could it have anything to do with the book? Euphemia asked. I wouldn't jump to any conclusions just yet, but he would get Reuben to come and have a look. And George is listening. The swish of curtains. Isn't that right, George? George's eyes flickered open, and he stared into the green-eyed gaze of Marvella Moody, library physician. She wore a blue pinafore dress with a white lab jacket, her black hair piled in a beehive. What book are you talking about? Marvella smirked. It's nothing you need to worry about. You need to get some rest. Euphemia ran to him, her blonde curls bouncing around her head. George, what happened? You were meant to be doing chores. George winced as Euphemia hugged him. I was doing my chores. A snake touched my hand. I jumped and fell off the ladder and kept falling. You're lucky the gorilla got there when he did, Euphemia said. Marvella tapped the silver thermometer in her breast pocket. Where was this? George leant away from Euphemia's smattering of kisses to answer. The mausoleum. When I fell off the ladder, it disappeared. Marvella and Euphemia glanced at one another and away again. What's wrong? Marvella grinned and lifted George's rucksack off the floor. There's nothing wrong. You need to go home and rest in your own bed. Fine. George pushed himself up and climbed off the bed. He reached into his pocket and removed the bag of chocolate mice. Want one? Go on then. She selected a mouse and bit off its head. Delicious. Come back if there are any more problems. He pocketed the bag. A chocolate mouse, and you think there might be more problems? George shook his head. What is the world coming to? He grinned at Marvella, who smiled back. George walked towards the main door. He held it open for Euphemia, who tapped him on the head. Such a gentleman. They made their way down an empty aisle. The books didn't whisper, the lights appropriately dim for any old library. George looked up. The ceiling was a few feet over the tops of the bookcases. There were no apes swinging from vines, or birds squawking. The faint scent of gunpowder that usually permeated the library wasn't present. Everything was decidedly normal. Why does the medical bay have to be normal? George asked. No rogues, no whispers, no nothing. I am a rogue, George. Euphemia walked with her nose in the air, her chest and bottom out, looking as though she might topple over. But you came here. No rogues stay here. Marvella treats mundane patients as well. Why? There must be medical bays outside. I've read books. The library widened towards the end of the aisle. How will you cope outside, George, if you don't like the mundane? There's no roof outside. I can't see it here, but it's there, isn't it? I never thought of... Euphemia stopped in her tracks and pursed her lips. She sniffed and turned to the right, darting past George. He chased after her, a hand to his chest, but she moved faster than him. They flew through the door into an aisle on the ground floor. There was no light in the library, everything overcast by a blue hue of semi-darkness. Not now, Euphemia said. She lifted her skirts and ran as fast as she could towards the foyer. George swung his arms and legs, trying to keep up. Their feet clattered against the tiles. In the foyer, Euphemia pressed her snout against the front door and inhaled. A thin beam of light crept through the keyhole. After a few moments, she stepped back and said, I need to find Sempronia. Can't you call her? I left my mask at home. Euphemia bounded across the foyer to the end of the aisle. George, go see if you can find a librarian. I'll go up here. Meet me back in 1 minute precisely. Euphemia disappeared around the corner, and George set off the way they had come. The bookcases were a blur as he passed them. He looked above every now and then to check for low-swinging apes. The aisles were empty. Hello? He called. Is there anyone there? We need some help. George! He turned back and ran towards the foyer once again, meeting Euphemia at the door. Did you find anyone? She asked, eyes wide and hopeful. George shook his head. There's no one there. I think they must have gone on their lunch. Sweat beaded on Euphemia's brow as she pulled at her collar. We need to get you back to house. She grabbed George's arm, digging her nails through the fabric of his jumper. She dragged him to the end of an aisle and towards the lift, but as they approached, they became aware of a single, disturbing fact. The figment wasn't in the lift. Euphemia sped to the cage and stepped inside. On the floor, her eyes closed, lay the slight, faded wisp of the figment. Euphemia groaned and ran a hand through her hair. There's only one other option, George. What is it? Hide. I'm going to go and get help. You hide, and once we get the all clear, I'll come and get you. Euphemia bent down and pecked him on the cheek. Everything will be fine if you just hide. She left him stood there and disappeared back the way they came. George shuffled towards the cage and looked down at the figment. He gulped and held onto the bars. He had to find somewhere to hide. George turned around and looked from left to right. There was no one there. He breathed deep and ran after Euphemia. He only got as far as the foyer before stopping in his tracks. The front door was open. Light streamed through the doorway, illuminating the bookcase across from it. George approached the door. There was no sign of the ghost. Instead, warm light beamed across his face. His heart stuttered in his chest, a thrill of excitement at the opportunity presenting itself. Euphemia had told him to hide. He had no idea what he was hiding from, but he knew that the threat was inside. He'd find safety outside. All he wanted to do was try real lemonade. He'd spend the afternoon outside, giving the Uglies plenty of time to sort things out in the library for his return. He saw nothing in the library but darkness. All was an eerie shade of blue that made his tongue cling to the roof of his mouth and his breath stop in his chest as though someone had corked his lungs. "I don't belong here," he said. George's hands scrabbled with the handle as he heaved a breath and stepped through the door. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Ink. But George was not outside. At least he didn't think he was outside, because if all the outside had to offer was a long white corridor towards a pair of glass doors, then somebody had a lot of explaining to do. George expected to feel the warm rush of sunlight on his face, to inhale the scent of wild garlic, honeysuckle, and all the other smells he'd read about. Instead, warm air blew from a broken extractor fan into George's face, and the only scent he could smell was damp mildew and dung. It was like being inside an ape's toilet hut, and even they cleaned up every other Sunday. No, this definitely wasn't what George had anticipated in the slightest. The door slammed shut behind him as soon as he'd stepped through, and it wasn't letting him back into the library. Even when George offered to varnish its hinges every day for a month, the door still refused to open, and as such George only had one direction to go in. He'd never experienced claustrophobia before, but being trapped inside the corridor did cause his chest to tighten. He felt as though he were locked in a tomb, forgotten in some lost catacomb. It was with this thought that George set off down the corridor. He became aware of the beetles when one chose to make a home in his sock. Having spent most of his childhood in the jungle, where the apes would sometimes serve beetles for lunch, George remained unfazed. That was until the beetle tried to unravel his sock. George felt its pincers slip beneath the thread and pull. He reached into his sock and removed it. The beetle was clearly unhappy. It wriggled in George's hand, little legs running through air and going nowhere. "What do you think you're doing?" George asked. The beetle chittered furiously and dropped the thread. George put the beetle down, convinced that if he spoke their language, he would have learned a great deal many new swear words. He watched the beetle scurry away. It squeezed itself between the cracks in the floor. At this point, George realised this was not the hardwood floor of the library. It was too flimsy and carpeted by a thick layer of dust. Each muffled step resulted in George's feet looking like the insides of a vacuum cleaner, as though two giant dust bunnies grew from his ankles. George crouched down. He reached into the crack where the beetle had disappeared and lifted. The floor was made of old book covers, haphazardly stitched together. When George lifted one, he found nothing but sand. Sand and beetles. George wondered why he'd been told the front door led outside. He dropped the book cover and headed towards the doors at the end of the corridor, hoping they might shed some light on his location. George approached, uncertain. The doors looked heavy. Each was one ginormous pane of jade glass, brass handles connecting in the centre, giving the impression of a nose. Smoke rose within the panes of jade glass, twisting and twirling. Sometimes the curls looked like letters, an M or a W, even an E. Others warped into images, hooks and amorphous blobs. George reached for the right-hand door handle. He recoiled when a slow buzz filled his head, vibrations against his skull. His brow creased at the unmistakable sound of voices, like hearing a crowd of people whisper to one another, only picking out odd words and phrases, unable to make sense of the conversation. George tensed, practically resting his ears on his shoulders. The whispers in his head increased in volume but remained incomprehensible as the shapes in the door gained speed, swirling furiously in the glass. A wave of nausea crested over George. He dropped to his knees, a dust cloud rising around him. The voices sounded like the static of a television without frequency. Tears burned in his eyes as he pressed his fists to the side of his head. When the voices threatened to overtake his mind, he found a small vestige of strength. "Shut up!" he yelled, the words bursting their way from his lungs. Silence fell. George remained kneeling in the old, dusty corridor. He heaved a few breaths from deep within. His shoulders trembled as the dizzying voices dissipated. After a few minutes, he opened his eyes. Nothing. No smoke in the door, no voices in his head. George pulled himself to his feet. "What was that about?" he asked, but there was no one around to hear him. He rubbed his sweaty palms on his jeans, heaved a breath in the hopes of alleviating some of the tension in his chest. There was no going back. He might not be outside, but he needed to find out where this door led, why it had been kept secret. George reached for the other handle this time, hoping this one wouldn't come with a side order of voices. It didn't. As his palm met the brass, the corridor started to spin. George screamed. He held tight to the handle as the walls spun around him, their colours no longer mere white, but flipping through colours and images as though George were trapped in the middle of a kaleidoscope. He locked his feet against the carpet of book covers, focusing on pressing his soles against the grains of dust. Voices again. He couldn't understand them. There wasn't an ounce of whispering to be heard. These voices roared. Next came the wind. Only this wasn't a breeze, a mere wisp of springtime welcome in the extreme heat of summer. This was furious. A tornado locked inside a corridor with George at its centre. His legs flailed behind him as his feet were torn from the ground. Still, he kept a firm hold of the door handle, thinking about the grooves scratching against his palm. He wasn't thinking about the sweat on his palms, how in moments he could lose grip and find himself blown back down the corridor. Maybe if he had, he could have prepared himself for the sensation as his hold loosened, and, with a lurch and a scream, he flew back the way he came. His stomach was in his throat. If he didn't get out of the corridor soon, he was going to throw up. George searched for something to grab onto. His eyes widened. He headed straight towards the door he'd come through, the locked door. He covered his face, braced himself for the pain of being slammed at speed into an old oak door. Only he didn't hit the door. It flew open at the last moment. He felt like he had no control of his limbs as he was tossed from the corridor back into the library. George crashed against the floor of the foyer. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving him on his back, winded. The foyer was empty, and the blue hue remained settled over the library. It took him a few moments to realise, but George grew aware that the tiles beneath him were wet. His movements caused the sticky fluid to squelch. He ached as he turned himself over. The tiles were caked in a thick pool of slimy black liquid. It trailed away, heading across the foyer, down the aisle where George had left Euphemia. George placed his fingers into the liquid. He played with it between his fingers. It felt oily and stained his fingertips a bruised purple. It smelled like paint with sweet, fruity undertones. Ink. He wiped his fingers on his trousers and glanced around. He stood up. George followed the trail to the first aisle and turned right. As he continued, he kept an eye on the other aisles, checking them for librarians, figments or rogues. He scanned the tops of the shelves, but there were no apes. Their vines hung limp in the air far above him. The ink trail thickened towards the end of the aisle. George smelt him before he saw him. Mowgli? He dropped from a bookcase, landing beside George. Are you all right? Grantham says you fell. Have you been in the Woodhouse's perfumery again? Emma's been trying things with lavender. Do you like it? Mowgli grinned. His dress had gained a few stains since the morning, baked beans and muck, and George was certain the remains of a dung beetle covered Mowgli's left shoulder. If you're going to have lavender perfume, shouldn't you wear a purple dress? I didn't feel like changing. Mowgli offered a shrug. Why are you covered in ink? George told Mowgli about the corridor. So, the door doesn't lead outside? Nope. Have you any idea where everyone is? Mowgli shook his head. I only came looking for you because I thought you were hurt. I think we should follow this trail. We're going to get into trouble again, aren't we? Do you mind? We're always in trouble, George. It's who we are. They walked to the end of the aisle, coming to an alcove. The bookcases were arranged in a circle. George followed the ink trail with his eyes. It crossed the alcove before coming to a stop. George's mouth fell open at the sight of the creature who had left the trail. It must have been 8 foot tall at least, and made entirely from ink, like a giant black slug, its shape constantly shifting as waves of ink passed through it, a waterfall trapped in humanoid form, with tentacles where its hands should be. It wasn't just the ink causing George's shock. It was the person the ink spoke to, because standing in the centre of the alcove was none other than the curator of the library, Reuben Sprite. George opened his mouth to say something, only to find himself dragged back down the aisle by Mowgli. He pulled them both to the left, out of view. What was that for? George whispered. There was a giant ink monster, George. I saw that. Talking to the curator. That too. Where did it come from? I think we followed its trail from the foyer. Mowgli almost burst with excitement as he came to his conclusion. He said, What if the ink is what was hidden behind the front door? George would have responded had it not been for the fact that Mowgli flickered. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't, only to appear again in an instant. What happened? George asked, concern in his eyes. Mowgli took hold of one of the shelves to steady himself. I don't know. They looked down to see a tentacle wrapped around Mowgli's ankle, winding its way from the alcove. It was like a tree trunk made from licorice, pulsing as it drained the colour from Mowgli's skin. George clenched his fist and stepped out from behind the bookcase. He stormed towards the alcove. Sprite had disappeared, but the ink stood there, as imposing as ever. Its neck had an unnatural elasticity, snaking across the alcove towards George, leaving its body behind, whilst its tentacles still reached beneath a bookcase to grasp Mowgli's ankle. The ink sniffed the air as it stretched its neck, like a boar snuffling for truffles. Its face reached George. A chill froze the hairs on the back of his neck, spread down his spine, a shock of spiderwebs crossing his ribcage. George focused on the ink's body in place in the centre of the alcove. He hoped if it really wanted to do damage, its neck needed to be closer to its body, not stretched thin like Play-Doh. George stepped back tentatively. He glanced at the ink's tentacle, still draining Mowgli, and took his chance. Gulping back his fear, George stomped down on the tentacle. It was surprisingly tough as he ground his foot down until the ink tore itself away. It roared in agony, a high-pitched growl sounding like a lion with a cheese grater down its throat. George spun around and ran back to Mowgli. Run! He grabbed his friend and they pelted towards the end of the aisle. George kept an eye on Mowgli, but he still faded. His dress looked as though it had spent too long out in the sun, and his pale brown skin dimmed to translucency. The ink chased them. It crashed down the aisle, bounding after them with all the speed of a leopard. They came to the end of the aisle. George reached for Mowgli again to pull him right, heading back towards the foyer, but his hand slipped right through Mowgli's arm. Mo? The ink slammed a tentacle into George's chest. He catapulted backwards, the library a blur as he was thrown to the ground. Ignoring his pain, he jumped to his feet as fast as he could. It was too late. The ink cradled a translucent Mowgli in his arms. It held its tentacle against his chest, draining him until Mowgli's eyes shut and his head lolled towards the ink. In no time at all, Mowgli disappeared completely. George sank to his knees. He thought tears would come to his eyes, but the ache in his chest was too much. It felt like there were a rock where his heart should be, weighing him down. Mowgli was gone, his closest friend lost, all because he'd come to check George was okay. The ink turned on George. He had to get away, find the uglies and get them to help. Maybe if they got rid of the ink, Mowgli would come back. George found some strength. He held on to a bookcase and pulled himself up. He stared levelly at the ink for a few seconds, getting his bearings. He glanced to either side of him. The ink was intent of each slight turn of George's head. He needed to be quick. He faked right before darting to the left, heading down another aisle. The ink roared after him, as fierce as a grizzly bear protecting their cubs. George focused on the pounding of his feet against the linoleum, the scuffing of his soles. He went right at the end of the aisle, back towards the alcove. George stopped to catch his breath. In that moment, he realised he couldn't hear the ink. There was no heavy slamming of its tentacles against the ground, or its grizzling as it chased him. His heart thudded in his chest as he faced the way he came. The ink wasn't there, and he had no idea where the ink had disappeared to. George took a step backwards, his foot slipping in the ink trail left behind. He continued to step backwards, eyes on the empty aisle, checking the tops of the bookcases in case the ink chose to head upwards. He allowed himself a glance at the vines, more in the hope of seeing the gorillas coming to his aid. They weren't. Nor were the uglies. Even though Euphemia knew where he was, she wasn't there. She hadn't come back for him. He had no idea where anybody was, and they had no idea he was trapped on the ground floor with an ink monster. If it drained him like Mowgli, perhaps they'd never know where he'd gone. George's back hit a bookcase. He stopped, gave himself a few moments to breathe, to think about what to do. Moments later, he became aware of something dripping on his shoulder. He froze. His spine went rigid. George looked up, slowly, fear etched into every pore at what he might see. The ink hung onto a bookshelf above him, stuck to the wood like a snail to stone. It stretched out a tentacle, revealing a red velvet pouch. George kept his eyes on the ink as he headed back towards the aisle. He was out of time. The ink upended the pouch. With a swing of its tentacle, it sent the contents flying across the alcove. Red dust landed on the bookcases, settled into pages. The dust covered every surface around George, yet somehow avoided him. He should have run, surged back towards the foyer, tried the door again and hidden himself in the corridor. The dust crackled. At first it popped. Small flames ignited across the clearing. The pops became bursts. George could do nothing more than scream when the dust exploded. Fire followed the trail of ink and dust, headed straight towards him. End of chapter 3. And them's the chapters. Those are the first 3 chapters of my children's book, currently entitled The Book of Heroes. Do feel free to let me know your thoughts about these chapters in the comments below. Hopefully at some point in the near future I will be able to go back and finish this rewrite, because I only had about 5 chapters left to do when I put it aside last year. Happy World Book Day. How are you celebrating? What are you reading for World Book Day? What are your plans for World Book Day? Do feel free to let me know that as well. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.